Imagine you are in London, 1940. The air raid sirens wail. In the cold, black night, the sky is crisscrossed by searchlights. The deep, guttural thump, thump, thump of German bombers, the Luftwaffe, is the sound of approaching death. Then, from the ground, comes the answer. The crash and thunder of hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. The ack-ack. The sky fills with small, dark puffs of smoke as the shells explode. But the bombers just keep coming. Night after night, the bombs fall. London burns. The guns are firing, but they are not hitting anything. This is the story of one of the greatest and most secret technical crises of World War II. It's the story of an impossible problem that was costing the Allies the war. And it's the story of a magic invention, smaller than a beer can, that was more closely guarded than the atomic bomb. And that, in the end, would save London, destroy the Japanese Air Force, and win the most crucial battles of the war. To understand the solution, you must first understand the problem. And the problem was math. How do you hit an airplane 3 miles up, flying at 300 miles per hour in the dark? The anti-aircraft gunners were trying to solve an impossible three-dimensional equation in a matter of seconds. They had to aim their gun, not where the plane sonmati, but where it would be in the 15 seconds it took the shell to reach its altitude. But even if their aim was perfect, they had a second, even harder problem: the fuse. The shell itself was just a metal canister. To make it explode, it had a tiny clockwork timer in its nose, a time fuse. Before the shell was loaded, a gunner had to look at the fire control computer, which was guessing the plane's altitude. He would then take the shell, insert it into a fuse setting machine, and twist a tiny mechanical dial. This dial set the timer: 10 seconds, 12 seconds, 15 5 seconds. If their guess of the plane's altitude was off by even 50 feet, the timer was wrong. The shell would explode harmlessly, hundreds of yards in front of the bomber, or hundreds of yards behind it. It was a war of near misses. The statistics were horrifying. In the 1940 Battle of Britain, British Anti-Aircraft Command fired 18,000 shells to shoot down one German plane. The system was a failure. The top-down solution of bigger guns and better mechanical computers wasn't working. The Allies were desperate. They needed something new. They needed a smarter shell. What if the shell didn't need a timer? What if the shell could see? This was the holy grail of ordnance, the proximity fuse, a fuse that would automatically explode, not at a set time, but when it got near its target. The concept was simple. The execution was considered physically impossible. The British had been working on the idea since 1939. Their best scientists had experimented with photoelectric fuses, acoustic fuses, and even radio wave fuses. They had made some progress, but they were being bombed into the Stone Age. They couldn't manufacture a solution on that scale. In September 1940, at the height of the Blitz, a top-secret British delegation sailed to America, which was still neutral. It was called the Decisive mission. They brought with them a black, locked box containing Britain's most vital secrets, the cavity magnetron, which would lead to airborne radar, and their fragmented, desperate research on the proximity fuse. The Americans, under the direction of the brilliant scientist Vannevar Bush, immediately understood the stakes. The problem was given to a new, highly secret division of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, codenamed Section T, The man put in charge was a physicist named Tuve. Tuve gathered the nation's brightest minds at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. They were given a blank check and an impossible task. To build a proximity fuse, they had to invent from scratch a device that could 1. Be a complete, self-contained radio station, a transmitter, and a receiver. 2. Be no larger than a pint milk bottle, to fit in the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell. 3. Be powered by its own generator, one that would only turn on after being fired. 4. Be ruggedized to withstand the single most violent, non-destructive event in human engineering. This last point was the one that made most engineers say it was impossible. When an artillery shell is fired, it is subjected to G-forces of over 20,000 ton Gs, that is, 20,000 times the force of gravity, applied in a fraction of a second. A human being will black out at 8 or 9 Gs. A standard radio vacuum tube, the delicate glass and wire heart of all electronics at the time, would be crushed into a fine powder. The team at Section T had to invent a vacuum tube that was not only tiny, but could be fired from a cannon, and still work. They tried everything. They built tiny, ruggedized tubes, nesting the components in shock-absorbing wax. They fired them from a smooth-bore cannon into a pile of sandbags, then dug them out to see if they survived. Most were just dust. But slowly, by 1941, they were getting closer. They created acorn tubes, with components so small and strong they could, sometimes, survive the launch. Next, the power source. How do you build a battery that sits dormant for years, but activates instantly on firing? They invented a spin battery. The components of the battery, zinc and carbon plates, were kept separate. The liquid electrolyte was held in a small glass ampule. When the shell was fired, the rotational spin of the shell, over 25,000 revolutions per minute, would crush the glass ampule. The centrifugal force would then spin the liquid electrolyte, forcing it into the plates, activating the battery and powering up the fuse. Finally, the radio itself. The concept was pure genius. The tiny fuse would transmit a continuous, high-frequency radio wave. This wave would radiate out from the shell in a 70-foot bubble. As long as the shell was flying through empty air, this wave remained stable. But the moment the shell got near a metal object, like the aluminum skin of a German bomber, that radio wave would reflect back to the fuse's receiver. This echo would be detected. The returning signal would trigger a thyrotron switch, which would instantly detonate the 20 pounds of high explosive in the shell. The shell wouldn't have to hit the target. It just had to get close. The lethal blast and shrapnel cloud would do the rest. By early 1942, they had a working prototype. They called it the VT Fuze, for variable time. It was a deliberately boring name, designed to be meaningless if it was ever intercepted. In August 1942, at a test range, they fired 3 VT fuses from a 5-inch gun at a drone target plane. All 3 shells brought the drone down. The scientists were stunned. They had achieved the impossible. But now, the fuse entered a new, even more secretive phase. The military commanders who saw the reports were terrified, not of the weapon, but of the Germans capturing it. This fuse, they realized, was a war-winning weapon. If the Germans or Japanese got their hands on it, reverse-engineered it, and used it against Allied bombers, it would be a catastrophe. The order was given from the highest level. The proximity fuse was a secret, more closely guarded than the atomic bomb. it was forbidden to be used over land, where a dud shell could be recovered by the enemy. Its first deployment would be with the US Navy in the Pacific, where any unfired shell would be safely buried at the bottom of the ocean. The Fuses were shipped in the thousands under armed guard to the US Pacific Fleet. They arrived in late 1942 during the grinding, brutal campaign for Guadalcanal. The US Navy was engaged in near-daily battles with Japanese aircraft, whose pilots were highly skilled and aggressive. The American 5-inch anti-aircraft gun was a good weapon, but it suffered from the same fatal flaw as its British counterparts, the Fuze. Japanese Betty and Kate bombers could fly through the flak with agonizing regularity, dropping their torpedoes and bombs. On January 5, 1943, a US task force, led by the light cruiser USS Helena, was sailing off the coast of Guadalcanal. The Helena was a ship of veterans. Her gunners had been fighting for months. They were good, but they were used to seeing their targets fly through their best-aimed salvos. That day, they had been issued the new, mysterious VT Fuses. The ordnance officers gave them simple, baffling instructions. Do not fire these at targets near the shore. Do not fire them if the plane is flying low. Only use them on high-altitude bombers over deep water. The gunners were skeptical. Then the radar operator called it bogies, inbound, high. A squadron of Japanese Val dive bombers appeared. High-altitude specks against the sun, maneuvering to attack the task force. The Helena's main gun director spun, locking onto the lead plane. The mechanical computers calculated the range, speed, and bearing. The data flowed to the 5-inch gun mounts. Load VT, the order came. The loaders shoved the new shells home. The breech blocks slammed shut. The guns elevated, tracking the distant targets. Commence firing. The ship erupted in the deafening sequential crack of its 5-inch battery. The gunners braced, watching the sky, expecting to see the usual distant puffs of black smoke, uselessly behind the targets. Instead, something magic happened. The first salvo, which was still thousands of feet away from the lead Japanese plane, reached it. The lead Val didn't smoke. It didn't trail fire. It simply disintegrated. A direct hit, a bright orange flash, and then just a cloud of black smoke and falling debris. The gunners on the Helena stared, silent for a split second. They had never seen that before. The computers tracked the next plane. The guns fired again. Bang. The second Val was obliterated, its wing sheared clean off, tumbling end over end into the sea. The Japanese pilots, who were masters of flak evasion, were in a state of terrified confusion. There was no flak to evade. They were flying through empty sky, and then their wingmen were just exploding. It was as if the Americans had built an invisible wall of shrapnel. The attack, which would have normally been a deadly running battle, was over in 90 seconds. The surviving Japanese planes dumped their bombs in the ocean and fled. On the deck of the Helena, the gunners were cheering, but they were also baffled. They had no idea how they had done it. The official report from the Helena's captain was electric. The secret was out, at least within the Navy. The Fuses were rushed to every carrier, cruiser, and battleship in the fleet. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the VT Fuse systematically slaughtered the Japanese Air Force. Kill rates for naval gunnery, which had been agonizingly low, skyrocketed by 400, 500, even 700%. The Fuze was a primary, unsung hero of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where US gunners, for the first time, had total confidence that their shells would hit. But the war wasn't just in the Pacific. Back in Europe, the original problem was about to return in a terrifying new form. In June 1944, just days after D-Day, the first of Hitler's vengeance weapons fell on London. The V-1, the Doodlebug. It was a pilotless, jet-propelled flying bomb. It flew at 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighters, and at a constant 2,000-foot altitude. It carried 1 ton of explosives, and it was aimed right at the heart of London. The anti-aircraft batteries that had failed so badly in 1940 were failing again. The V-1 was a perfectly predictable target. It flew in a straight line, at a constant speed, at a constant altitude. But the old clockwork time fuses were still too inaccurate to hit it. The guns were firing, and the V-1s were just flying right through the flak. London was in a panic. General Eisenhower and the Allied High Command were now facing a terrible choice. Their war-winning magic fuse was sitting in depots, forbidden from being used over land. But now, the only way to save London was to risk the secret. The pressure on Eisenhower was immense. Churchill and the British War Cabinet were desperate. London was in flames, morale was cracking, and the V-1 was more than just a terror weapon. It was a strategic one, aimed at disrupting the critical supply lines flowing to the Normandy beachhead. In mid-July 1944, the agonizing decision was finally made. The risk was justified. The order was given. Release the VT fuse for use against the Diver. Diver was the Allied code name for the V-1. Under conditions of extreme secrecy, US Army ordnance teams began flying crates of the fuses, now designated the M51 series POSIT fuse, to the anti-aircraft batteries defending southern England. The British gunners, exhausted and demoralized from weeks of futilely firing at the V-1s, were given the new shells. Just like the sailors in the Pacific, they were told these were a new experimental shell. They were instructed to fire them and simply observe the results. The results were not just good, they were miraculous. The first batteries to be equipped with the fuse saw their kill rates jump overnight. On the first Sunday, the fuses were in wide use. The gunners of ACAC Command brought down 24 V-1s. The next Sunday, they brought down 43. The Sunday after that, 79. The V-1, previously an almost impossible target, was now being swatted from the sky with horrifying regularity. The doodlebugs that had moments before been roaring toward London were now seen exploding in mid-air, a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke, long before they reached their target. General Frederick Pyle, the chief of British Anti-Aircraft Command, wrote that the fuses transformed the whole situation. The Allies quickly adapted their strategy. They moved the vast majority of their heavy anti-aircraft guns out of London and placed them in a dense 50-mile-long belt along the English coast. This was Diver Alley. Now the V-1s, coming in from their launch sites in France, had to fly through this impenetrable wall of magic flak. The statistics from this period are staggering. In the last 4 weeks of the V-1 campaign, as the German launch sites were being overrun by the advancing Allied armies, the AA guns of Diver Alley were at their peak. In the final week of August, of the 104 V-1s that entered the gun belt, the batteries shot down 82. The week after, they shot down 74. The V1 menace was, effectively, over. The magic fuse had saved London, and the secret, incredibly, was still safe. The Germans, in their desperation, never recovered a dud. Their intelligence reports concluded that their V1s were suffering from a rash of mechanical failures, or that Allied radar had become impossibly accurate. They never guessed the truth. The shells themselves were smart. The fuse had proven its worth in the skies over the Pacific and the fields of England. But the war was entering its final desperate phase. The Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were now pushing against the border of Germany itself. The fuse had one more secret, one more terrifying application that its designers had planned from the very beginning. It had been designed to explode near aircraft, but its radio wave trigger didn't know what it was looking for. It was simply set to detonate when its radio wave bounced off a solid object. The scientists at Section T had designed a second version. This one was designed for ground burst. The fuse would be fired from a howitzer. It would arc over the battlefield, silent, and as it descended, its radio wave would see the ground. It could be set to detonate 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet above the battlefield. It was the single most lethal anti-personnel weapon ever invented. And in December 1944, in the frozen, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, it was about to be unleashed. On December 16th, 1944, Hitler launched his last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Over 250,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks, held in secret reserve, smashed into a weakly held 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. The American divisions in their path, battle-weary or green and new to combat, were caught in a state of total catastrophic surprise. The offensive was masked by the worst winter weather in decades. Thick, low fog and unceasing snowstorms had grounded the entire Allied Air Force. The Allies' greatest advantage, their total air supremacy, was gone. The battle became a desperate primal fight on the ground. American GIs, freezing in foxholes, were overrun by Tiger II, King tanks, and waves of German panzer grenadiers. The American army was in full panicked retreat. The German advance was brutal and swift. But the German commanders knew they had a critical weakness. They had no air support, and their artillery was outnumbered 10 to 1. They were relying on shock, speed, and the terrible weather to win. As General George S. Patton's Third Army wheeled north in a desperate bid to rescue the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne, his artillery units were firing into the fog, but with little effect. Standard artillery shells, set with point-detonating fuses, were proving useless. When they hit the soft snow-covered ground of the Ardennes, the blast was almost completely smothered. A German soldier in a foxhole or a trench was perfectly safe, even from a near miss. The American artillery could hear the German panzers, but they couldn't see them, and they couldn't stop the infantry that was advancing with them. The crisis had reached its peak. The entire Allied front in the west was on the verge of collapsing. At this exact moment, the order that had been held back for 4 years was finally given. Authorized use of posit fuses for all artillery. Trucks, which had been secretly stockpiled with the new VT fuses, raced through the snow to the artillery batteries of the Third Army. The gunners, who were exhausted and freezing, were handed the new shells. They were told to set the fuse cap to prox and fire them over the coordinates of the advancing Germans. In the forest near Bastogne, a German Panzergrenadier unit was advancing, confident in the snow and fog. They were veterans, and they knew the sound of American artillery. They heard the faint, high-pitched whistle of incoming 155mm shells. As they had been trained to do 1,000 times, they hit the dirt. They dropped flat in the snow, dove behind logs, and huddled in their shallow foxholes. They braced for the familiar, muffled crump, crump, crump of the shells hitting the earth. But the explosions never came from the ground. Instead, 20 feet above their heads, the sky erupted, with a series of terrifying sharp cracks that were louder than any shell they had ever heard. The VT-fused shells detonated in the air. Each shell exploded like a giant invisible shotgun, blasting a cone of thousands of red-hot, high-velocity shrapnel fragments downward onto the German soldiers. The snow offered no protection. The foxholes offered no protection. Lying flat was useless. The shrapnel cloud came from above, ripping through the trees, the snow, and the men. The German assault wave simply ceased to exist. German soldiers who survived the first salvos were in a state of pure terror. They had seen no flash from the ground. There were no craters. Their comrades were dead, killed by an invisible, magical fire that came from the empty sky. They called it magic fire, an air-bursting shrapnel. This scene was repeated across the entire Ardennes front. The American artillery, which had been ineffective, suddenly became the single most lethal weapon of the battle. Even in the fog, the gunners didn't need to see the enemy. They just needed a rough coordinate. They could fire a salvo, and the magic fuses would automatically detect the trees, the ground, or even a German tank, and detonate at the perfect, preset height to kill every soldier in a 50-yard radius. The VT fuse broke the back of the German infantry assault. It separated the Panzer Grenadiers from their panzers, leaving the tanks blind and vulnerable to American bazooka teams. General Patton, a man not easily impressed, was stunned. He saw the reports. He saw the effect on the battlefield. He later wrote, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." The Battle of the Bulge was won. The German army was shattered, its last reserves of manpower spent. When the war in Europe ended, the secret was finally fully revealed. The proximity fuse, a weapon kept secret for 4 years, had 3 distinct victories. First, it had saved the US Navy in the Pacific. Second, it had saved London from the V1. And third, it had been the decisive battlefield-winning weapon that slaughtered the German army in the Battle of the Bulge. More than the atomic bomb, which was used only twice, this tiny, rugged radio, invented by a team of civilian scientists, was the weapon that truly, technically, and decisively won the Second World War.